Are you an adventurer looking to take your hunt to the next level? Then you're in the right place. Welcome to East Meets West Hunt with your host, Beau Martonik.
Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the East Meets West Hunt podcast presented by Spartan Forge. On today's episode, I am joined by Garrett Prahl of the DIY Sportsman. Garrett geeks out on e-scouting and is very detail-oriented when it comes to scouting public land whitetails. We discuss finding areas with diversity, identifying hunting pressure, historical wind data, buck and doe bedding areas, finding specific vegetation types, Lidar maps, categorizing waypoints, and much more. If you like the podcast, please go over to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to it and give a rating and review. That helps out so much, but doesn't help out as much as just sharing it with your friends. Anybody you think would gain value from listening to this, I'd really appreciate that. And I hope you enjoy this episode with Garrett Prahl. The Spartan Forge app utilizes years of military background and machine learning to pull from millions of data points to accurately predict deer movement, including GPS data, 30 years of weather, academic, and state research. The new app includes GPS mapping with incredible aerial imagery, offline dependability, deer prediction, weather updates, journal entries, and much more. You can use the code EastMeetsWest to save 20% off the Spartan Forge app at spartanforge.ai. And if you're on the fence about it, use the 14-day free trial, put in the code EastMeetsWest, and cancel if you're not a fan, but I think you will like it. Tethered is a company founded on the principles of educating the hunting community on saddle hunting while creating the most innovative, lightweight, safe products for saddle hunting. They have mobile hunting gear options for all types of hunters and continue to push the envelope. Speaking of pushing the envelope, they just dropped their new carbon fiber saddle, the Vader platform, at the ATA show and will be available this summer. And if you haven't seen it, the Skeletor climbing sticks are out and just a little bit heavier than the one sticks, fold up nicely, but they come with a lot less price point. So I think you'll be happy with those if you head over to tetherednation.com, check out some of the tethered products, and just to learn about saddle hunting. Maven is building the highest quality optics at half the price of their competitors through their direct-to-consumer business model. They want to create the best optics for the job, period. Their products are backed with a lifetime no-fault warranty and an incredible customer experience. Maven just launched the CRS-1 and CRS-2, the first rifle scopes in the award-winning C-Series collection. Based on the popularity of the C-Series optics and on request from customers, they developed a completely new lineup of rifle scopes at a lower cost. You can use the coupon code EastMeetsWest-gift for a free gift with any full-price optics order at mavenbuilt.com. Kit Folks is the co-founder of Under Armour and Big Truck Farms, an avid hunter and just an all-around hardworking American. When I heard that he was building a brewery, I was excited to check it out. Since then, I've become friends with Kip, and Big Trucks Farms has grown into what I would expect. He has been extremely supportive of this podcast and hunting in general, so it went without saying that Big Truck would make a great partner of the show. The Big Truck name and icon promotes the idea of adventure and going past the unknown. They embrace the mindset of hard work in the outdoor lifestyle on the farm with an earn a beer mentality. They support and host archery shoots, donate to veterans, and make damn good beer. Check out Big Truck Farms at btfbeer.com and visit the farmhouse in Parkton, Maryland. Hey guys, last year was a wild year for censorship for hunters and anglers. We partnered with the social media platform Go Wild to combat mainstream social media censorship. Go Wild was built by outdoorsmen and women, by hunters and anglers just like you. Go Wild is a free social community. Not only are your photos not censored, they're encouraged on Go Wild. Go Wild gives you points for things like sharing your trophies, gear reviews, and inviting friends. And you can earn points to unlock rewards, gift cards, free swag, knives, huge discounts on brands like Garmin and Tethered, so much more. If you create an account, you get $10 just for signing up. Go to gowild.com to get started and use the code East Meets West to save 10% off all gear, including tethered saddle hunting equipment. All right, we're live. Garrett Prahl from the DIY Sportsman. Welcome to the show, man.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, I'm pumped. I'm pumped to get to talk to you on here. I met you in person finally at the Spartan Forge Veterans Hunt here this past November at Johnny's cabin, and I've been following along with your stuff and watching your YouTube channel and podcast and everything else for quite a while. It seemed like you were one of the originals with the YouTube game, as you've been in it for quite a while.
Yeah, it certainly seems like it at this point. And likewise, I've been following your content for quite a while now.
Yeah. And so I'd like for you to start off by giving a little bit of background on who you are and just a little bit about your information on what you've been putting out for however many years now.
Sure. So my YouTube channel, which is DIY Sportsman, it's kind of a mix of hunt videos, but also DIY projects related to hunting. Notable mentions would be like I did a laminated longbow. I built climbing sticks out of aluminum using a CNC router in my garage. Things like that. Also, a lot of product review videos, whether it's something that's related to mobile hunting or related to archery. And then also just videos that are maybe somewhat related to the tools that we can use as especially mobile hunters, where we're looking at a lot of different areas. We're doing a lot of scouting, and there's a lot of tools out there, some of which people are probably familiar with. Others, maybe they're not, but they can make our lives really a whole lot easier and make the e-scouting side of things a lot more efficient. So I had some videos way back when looking at things like, Google Earth and even like the old handheld Garmin, 62, like how to upload maps and do things on those types of units. So obviously the technology has come a long way since then, but that's kind of the content that I have liked to produce.
Yeah, but what I've from the outside looking at your stuff, you're someone that definitely geeks out on learning the details of these things and how to make them work the best for you and utilize tools and modify your own and do all of that. So it's been, I feel like I don't think I'm completely to your level by any means, but I like looking at the details and I like trying to continually find stuff, especially with scouting and anything else, and trying to become more efficient. And then once I learned your background, you're also an engineer by trade, correct?
Yeah, I started off as an engineer. I'm in project management now, but similar type of thing. I'm managing design projects and doing some design work every now and then on the side. So,
yeah. So you have that mind, that mindset, and you're kind of working that way in your normal day-to-day job as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and so with that being said, how long? When did you start your YouTube channel?
I think I opened the account probably in like 2006, but I didn't really start actively posting a whole lot until maybe 2011, 2012, somewhere in that time frame.
Yeah, still early though for putting that kind of stuff on YouTube. At least it feels like that. Excuse me, for me. And yeah, because I feel like when I was looking back on your channel and stuff, and once I became more familiar with you in the last, I don't know, 4 or 5 years, then I saw some videos I'd watched from almost 10 years ago that I didn't realize were even your stuff. You've been putting stuff out there for quite a while, that's for sure.
Yeah, when you throw the word decade into it, it really does put into perspective how long ago that was.
Yeah, I know it's 2022 already, and it is just crazy. But you and I have been able to work together pretty closely recently with Spartan Forge and working through that, as you talked about how far mapping has come a long ways and how we're able to aerial scout and do things now. It's so much different than it used to be, and with tools like that in place, it's just I don't know. I feel like we're very, very lucky at this point to be able to have these things.
Oh, absolutely. And it's a double-edged sword, right? If you knew how to do this stuff 10 years ago, you had a huge edge on everybody. If you know how to do this stuff now, the level of the average guy has gotten a lot greater, and you need to maybe add some more tools to the arsenal or supplement with more boots on the ground, that sort of thing. But definitely we live in a really great time frame for being able to utilize all of this information around us.
Yeah. And I think that's a good thing too, to start off with saying is, like as technology, and this is a whole different conversation, but as technology comes into hunting in a lot of different ways, that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be more successful. You need to know how to use it and still apply the work that comes along to it. And I know that we'll definitely be diving into that in more detail as far as, you can aerial scout all day, but if you can't confirm it or know what to look for when you're in the woods, that's a whole nother game.
Yeah. Yeah. Totally agree.
Yeah. So so kind of to start just diving into this a little bit, I want to talk to you about e-scouting and all of the details that go along with e-scouting. But because that's such a broad topic, I want to focus in on big woods stuff. And I know you hunt a decent amount of big wood stuff. Am I right?
Yeah. And it's probably good to define even, what big woods is there too, because there might be a 30,000 acre, let's say cattail swamp. Well, technically you could call that a big woods type of an environment. Or like when we go down to Missouri in like the Mark Twain area, it's all hill country, more or less, monotonous, kind of monoculture type of habitat. But I mean, you got tens of thousands of acres there. I'd consider that big woods. Or like the stuff when we went up to Pennsylvania this fall, I would absolutely consider that big woods as well. And it's all a little bit different, but there's definitely a lot of similarities there. So I guess, for the listeners, that's kind of where I'm driving from some of this experience is based on those types of habitat, and also now spreading more into like the northern Wisconsin type areas where it's flatter, but it's still kind of big woods and timbered, and you get a little bit more logging mixed in.
Yeah. And it's funny because when I first started like talking about this stuff, I realized there's like a bunch of, like you said, subcategories of big woods. And, then when it turns to hill country and when it turns to mountain country and when it, goes, It's like, it's crazy. And like, I've hunted a bunch of different types of areas, like, where of big woods, where there's some areas in Pennsylvania I hunt that are almost relatively flat across, and there's more swamps and different things that are mixed in. And then you got some really steep stuff that has a bunch of different levels to it, some with sheer drop-offs and not as much bench systems, and there's just so many different things. But I feel like if you get the concepts down to a lot of these things and are able to recognize it when you get into the woods, you can apply it to the different spaces.
Yeah. One thing I've sort of found is that even if I am not an expert in some of these specific subcategories of terrain, just putting some time into doing hunts every now and then, maybe one hunt a year or hunt every other year, something like that, you really learn a lot about that specific type of, habitat. But then you're able to also apply it when you see it here and there, even if it's like a secondary feature of some other place. You hunt a lot of hill country, and then you hunt a place that isn't really hill country, but it's got some topography to it in certain places. You can start to draw from that experience a little bit and maybe find things you wouldn't have otherwise known to look for if you hadn't already seen it in some other type of terrain.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And I think that's when you take, some of the really, successful hunters and stuff that I would consider like yourself in there. And then you have the people like the Andy Mays and stuff that can go to these different places and just get it done. It's because they're able to recognize, there's a lot of things, but they're able to recognize things that they found success in, or they found deer in, or they found bucks in from one area, and be able to apply that to another. Even though it might not be exactly the same, like you said, there might be a little bit of some sort of variation that looked similar in a different spot that you can apply it to this other area.
Yeah. And when we get into maybe some of the more specifics, the stuff that I originally started to e-scout and say like northern Wisconsin, compared to what I look for now, there's some similarities, but there's a whole lot of differences. Things that I thought would be good were okay, but a lot of times a lot of hunting pressure. And then stuff that I learned over time was really good. Now I know what that looks like on a map, and I never would have thought to look for that type of stuff on a map prior to that, actually hunting it. And now that makes my e-scouting, kind of when you go full circle, a lot more effective in that type of habitat.
Interesting. So let's start out with that then. I mean, so these things that you'd learned there, is this kind of what your starting point is? Like if you're looking, you're going to look at just say northern Wisconsin as a whole, like where are you starting with from the e-scouting standpoint of an area that looks good, or what are you considering at the beginning here?
So I'm looking for just generally max diversity, but there's also things that are important to me, like how far is this away from a big city? There's a lot of guys that drive over from the Minneapolis area to hunt Wisconsin, and there's some bigger cities in Wisconsin as well that will be kind of hubs for people driving out to hit some of these public pieces. It seems like the further north you go, the less hunting pressure you run into, but also, you get more wolves and the habitat's just not as good generally, and it gets, a little bit harder, lower deer density, et cetera. So kind of trying to find that sweet spot where you still got good deer numbers. Maybe there's ag close by. Maybe it is or isn't really close to specific parcels, but at least I know what kind of the soil quality is there just by looking at, where you can see sort of the ag areas from like a, 100,000 foot view. That can be helpful as well. But like you said, once you kind of get past that and narrow into more specific areas of the state, then it's like, okay, now that I have these chunks of 10, 20, 5,000 acres, whatever, which ones have the most diversity? And if I know that it has a lot of diversity, it means it's probably not going to be a one and done type of area where I would say go into a spot and I have the 3 best looking areas in mind, and if they're good, great, but if they're not, then it's like, okay, well, the rest of this stuff's kind of monotonous. Whereas if I find an area and I can see some clear cuts and I can see some swamps and I can see some beaver ponds and creek drainages and a little bit of rolling topography, and I can see tamaracks and maybe some spruce trees, but then also I can see areas where there's definitely hardwood ridges, and all of this stuff is kind of in the same 5,000-10,000 acre area, a lot of transition lines. That's the kind of stuff where I'm like, okay, even if this type of an area has a lot of hunting pressure, I know that there's probably more deer there for one, higher deer density than maybe areas that are more monotonous. But number 2, I know that I'm probably going to be able to find areas to get away from other people because there's a lot of kind of sub features within that type of landscape that'll hold deer and that deer will move into, even if they are getting pressured in certain spots of that.
Yeah. And like you said, I mean, with that max diversity, that's the first thing that I do the same way as you. And a lot of that too is just because, like you said, when it holds a deer, but no matter, when you have the areas that have a lot of the monotonous same type of timber, if it's, say you're relying on oak crop or something there and you don't have that, those deer can migrate miles away or do something. When you have those areas with all this different diversity and stuff in there, that holds them there, even if there is there's no acorns this year. Okay, well, they got browse from this clear cut. They have, they have beech nuts they could get over here if this is good. And they have just a bunch of different stuff that they can feed on, and grasses and all of that different stuff.
Yeah. There's the habitat can support them year round. And I know for sure there's doe groups that really don't like even move that much. Like you'll find them in the summer and they're feeding on clear cut, and then they're feeding on woody browse and things like that in the winter. But the amount of distance that they travel is not far at all.
Yeah. And so if you were to, outside of I guess, let me ask you one more question on the diversity side of it. So when you're talking about that habitat diversity, how much does terrain diversity come into that? Or are you mostly focused on looking at different vegetation types?
I guess that probably depend on the area. I probably prefer. I mean, ideally, yeah. If I have elevation or topography that's there as a baseline, I'd much prefer that it also has a whole bunch of diversity on the vegetation side of things. And I guess the same is true with flatland.
Yeah.
So I'm always looking for that. There's a lot of areas that you walk in, like hill country, and it's like, okay, there's a great pinch point here, but it's just like kind of wide open hardwoods and oak trees all over the place. And like the area in southern Missouri is kind of like that, where you can walk through it and you find maybe some hints of trails around really good pinch points, but there's not a lot of great pinch points, and there's oak trees at every elevation. and it all kind of looks monotonous. You get some of the creek bottoms. I mean, it's a little bit like Pennsylvania in certain areas that, from what I saw when I was there. Some of the creek drainages are where you got the thicker areas in general. Occasionally you have burn areas, which you can only really see if you were on the ground, if they were recent. But if I look at a spot and I can see like, oh man, there's vegetative transitions all over the place here, and you got the hills, then that's great. It seems like, if it was between, hey, I've got flat land and I've also got 3 miles away some like hilly stuff, and they both have really good vegetation transitions, a lot of like, I guess, diversity on that side of things. That's a really good question in terms of which one I'd prefer, because most likely the hillier area could hold more deer, and in some cases it maybe could hold bigger bucks because they have more scent advantage. I think a lot of times they're less likely to get killed. I see that a lot in like southern Minnesota, where it's like, how the amount of pressure, how can these deer grow old? But they do. They use that terrain to their advantage. The flip side of that is the flatland is probably going to be easier for me to hunt. So I would probably want to scout both of them. I'd prefer if I found what I was looking for on the flatter land, because it's easier for me to predict the wind and make a clean setup.
And that's really interesting that you said that, because I struggle with the flatter land, and I would rather have the hillier country. The wind is definitely the thing, but I feel like it funnels the movement down more with using the terrain and mixed with the vegetation. But just out of me personally, I found some bigger deer in some flatter areas that I struggle to figure out and how they move, because they don't have the terrain advantage. They have some of the vegetation stuff. So that's interesting on how you're thinking about that. But from the wind standpoint, that makes a ton of sense.
And it seems like if you do find a big deer in flat land, to your point, it's not like you can just go in there and kill them. It seems like their core areas are still pretty big. And even with the exact same weather conditions, exact same wind direction, exact same everything, it seems like even in that like late October timeframe when they start hitting their scrape circuits, it's like they won't hit the same one every day.
No.
maybe 2 or 3 times a week. And it's like, okay, if I get a consistent northwest wind, I can hunt over this great scrape on the downwind side of a bedding array, and I can hunt it 5 days in a row. And there's a good chance that 1 out of those 5 days I might get a crack at that buck. Whereas if it's hillier country, I feel like it takes a lot more time to figure out the place enough to where you can have those clean sits and find the clean access.
That's a very good point. And yeah, until you kind of get in there and check it out basically you have to hunt it to be able to know by checking the wind and dropping your milkweed and doing that. And you can do some sort of wind mapping, but that only gives you a very general idea, I feel like, until you get in there. And so, but I'm going to come back to that, but you said something I don't want to forget about. And you're talking about the pressure, and when you're looking at things there, you talked about like being, say far away from major cities and stuff, but what about within like, okay, you get down to a smaller area you're looking at, you find that terrain or just diversity in general that you're looking for. What are some things that you're looking at to kind of establish those zones of pressure, or things that are no-goes, and things that you're looking for?
So within like a specific piece of land, it seems like, especially if you've got hunter access trails or just straight up logging roads where they, access to take their timber out, those almost always will be hubs for a lot of the guys walking in. And depends on the place, depends on the people, but a lot of times guys aren't going too far in past that logging road. And so you can almost like, take a highlighter over a logging road and make it, like a wide swath, 200 yards on either side of that road. It might be 3 miles long. It might be 3 miles back. There's guys that'll take bicycles back there 3 miles and go 200 yards off the logging road. But it seems like there's fewer and fewer people that go, let's say 3/4 of a mile on that logging road and then cut way off another mile to walking. Or guys that are parking alongside the road and then just cutting in 200 yards and hunting near the road there.
Yeah. No, that and it's like you just said, and that makes sense too with like the people that it's always the end of the road syndrome. Like everybody wants to go to the end of the road to park and then go on and hunt, or if you just find a spot. I know some states don't allow it, but most, at least in Pennsylvania and some of the other states I've hunted, where you pull off along the road, maybe you have to go up a bank or up a hill right there. You don't even need to go in as far because, people like going to the end of the road and, moving in from that direction. And like you said, like just when it's easy for them to walk on, people will probably be a lot more willing to go in further than if they were, having to bushwhack or go off trail.
Yeah. The other thing I noticed a lot too is the types of features that are very commonly talked about, whether it's like, let's say it's something that's been around for years, like hunting saddles in hill country, or if it's something that's maybe more recent information, like a cattail or an oak island in a big giant cattail marsh. If it's really obvious like that, and it's something that people have been trained to look for, it seems to always have more hunter pressure than other little subtle edges and things like that you find by just covering boots on the ground. There's one place that I hunt where it's like you got this one oak island and it's surrounded by alders and wiregrass marsh, and then you got hardwoods nearby and like a big island, and it's way back in there. But every year there's hunter sign back there, there's trail cameras, and it's just too obvious. So you can almost look at a map now and it's like, okay, if there's one of those things, I'll go check it out. But I know in my mind that there's a good chance there's probably going to be hunter pressure there. Whereas if you got the same type of thing, but there's 30 of those oak islands in like a 5,000 acre chunk, okay, well, I can probably find one of those in any given day that has not had somebody in there for 3 months.
Yeah. Yeah, no, and then that makes sense. And being able to look for those areas that have the different ones there. Because I know, I don't know about you, but if you ever say you were to give one area of a map and give it to 5 people and say, look at the map and tell me where you would go at, I bet you with the information that's been out there and stuff, most people are going to pick the same places to go to. And I learned that from when I started hunting Southern Ohio, and I'd go in there and I'd be like, all right, I have to go find saddles. I got to do some, this stuff. And I'm hunting the rut, and I'd go into these spots, and it'd be ridiculous with how much human sign. There'd be a climber on the base of that tree over there. You'd have scent wicks hanging over top the scrape that was on the top of the saddle, and all these different things. And that didn't mean that, at least for me, when I looked at it, it's like, okay, that doesn't mean I shouldn't ignore those places. And sometimes you can find that good sign not very far from there, that they might just be skirting that or anything. But I like your thought process with, just trying to find where you have multiple circumstances in a specific area where those things look alike, and that you have better odds, I guess, odds multipliers of not running into people.
Yeah. Here's another thing I would kind of, I guess, keep as a qualifier for an area. How long is it going to take me to scout this? If I can take a map, let's say it's a 1,000 acre chunk you're looking at for sake of argument, and you're like, okay, I can hit the key areas I want to look at in one day, 7-mile loop. I want to go hit this, this, and this, and then I can come back. Versus, man, there's a lot of edge in here. I can maybe take one day and hit, this on a 5-mile loop, and then I can come in on a different 5-mile loop, hit all this edge. And then it's like, okay, if it takes me that long just to scout everything that could be good, then there's a lot higher likelihood that there's going to be places that are easy for me to find and hunt that are away from other hunter pressure. Even if some of those spots are getting hit by other hunters, like you're probably not going to have to move that far to find deer.
Yeah, that makes sense. And so with that, and so those are all the things that you're kind of looking for from a hunting pressure standpoint.
Yeah, that, and it seems like certain areas get hot or cold, whether it's based on, somebody shoots a 170 out of a particular area one year, and then the next 3 years is just pounded. And then maybe the other stuff around is hardly hit at all. And it seems like you get these like kind of little gradients where it goes up in hunting pressure for a few years, and then maybe it drops back off. Guys are like, man, there's just people everywhere. I'm not going to hunt here next year. And eventually it dies back off again. And then the deer, quality kind of jumps back up again. But that's something you obviously can't really tell from just e-scouting. You almost have to drive around during the season, see where all the vehicles are, talk to guys in the parking lot and that sort of thing to get a feel for that.
Yeah. And that's a harder one, like you said, to be able to identify until you're there. It's not like, I know you have hunted out west and stuff before, but like when you look at e-scouting for there, I always go back and look at historical imagery and try to find where everyone has camp set up, or look for September imagery to see where the trucks are parked at the trailhead to kind of give an idea. But it's not as easy in a lot of the forested areas in the, the Midwest and the East and the Northeast and stuff, where you can't see a lot of that stuff from the tree canopy as much.
Right.
So, okay, to kind of move back along to, the terrain and the vegetation features that you're looking at, I feel like, and I'm going to ask this question because I know you're big on this, but before you even start by, looking at this area, if you're trying to be efficient with your scouting, I know you're big on looking at historical wind directions, and I'd like you to kind of explain that thought process, because this is actually a new one to me that I didn't utilize until Bill showed me it within the Spartan Forge app, and then I found out that you've been using this, and it's something that's very something you use a lot.
Yeah, I used to have to dig deep into the web to find that historical wind data, but what I would use it for is, generally you have common wind directions in certain areas of the country, but there's minor differences. Maybe some places more predominantly a southwest for a large portion of the year. I know in, places in Minnesota where I hunt, it's like, okay, November hits and you get a lot of northwest, or you might get south if that, the cold front is fighting the warm front. But you don't really get a whole lot of, like, the southwest, you don't get a whole lot of east. East is like super rare in our area. But what I would do in looking at kind of the historical wind data is I wouldn't necessarily look at like the entire year and look at a wind rose for the entire year. I would look at month by month specific. And then what I'll learn as I look at September, okay, predominantly southerly winds, like southeast. And if I go to October, okay, now I got some more west mixed in there, maybe some northwest. And I look at November, and then it becomes more like bimodal almost, where you get either like the northwest or the southeast, but not as much of like the west or the east. And so then I can take that information and look at it from, I guess, how am I going to hunt this perspective, and also how are deer potentially going to use this perspective. And if you get a place that is in hill country and you anticipate that they're going to be using wind-based bedding, and you see a lot of, let's say bedding points that are facing west, right? To where if they were a leeward bedding, you'd have to have an east wind. And then on the other side of the drainage, you get the opposite. It's like, okay, well, I'm going to bet that more deer are likely to be bedding with that wind advantage if they, have that predominant wind direction during the month of, like, let's say November. If I want to go on an out-of-state trip and I'm banking on, a rut hunt where I have leeward ridge sits, then I'm not going to focus on the stuff that is set up for an east wind. I'm going to focus on the stuff that's set up for, the southeast and the northwest. And that really kind of eliminates a lot of dead space. It's easier, I think, when you anticipate wind-based bedding, for me anyway. But there's also instances where, let's say there's like a river system, or you have like a pond or a lake, beaver swamp, whatever. And it's like, okay, I can sit up on the northwest corner of this beaver swamp, and I can sit right on the edge. And I know that wind's going to blow from the woods, and it's going to blow my scent out over that beaver swamp. And those deer are going to cruise that edge up around that corner, and I can sit there pretty safely with that wind direction. So I'll look at it from that aspect too.
Yeah. No, I think, to me, learning that from someone that I feel like I've e-scouted, for a long time, and I loved doing it, and I just had never looked at it from that perspective, other than that I would always take the historical wind direction from my trail camera photos and look at it as far as specific deer, or when times were hot, what direction the deer were coming from with that, and look at it from that perspective. But really, like you said, especially if you're going out of state hunt, or if you have like a weekend to scout, and say you're able to go in the spring and scout ahead of time, or even if you don't, you're going in blind, you can really cut down on those areas and be efficient with it by, basically exiting out, blocking out a lot of these other areas if you're focusing on that.
Yeah, exactly. And there's always the chance that you do all this work and you focus on the most common wind directions, and you can see the upcoming forecast for your trip, and you get like 3 random days of east winds. Like there's always the chance that happens, and you just gotta go with it on the fly. But the fact that we now have that sort of in the Intel tab on Spartan Forge, like at your fingertips, you can just look it up whenever, makes it so much easier than what we used to have to do to get that info.
Yeah, no, it definitely does. And like you said, with the wind-based bedding, that can be super helpful when you have terrain systems. So how would you, in some, I guess you kind of talked about a little bit, but flatter areas with it, and basically the bedding being, on the edge of vegetation and stuff with the wind to their back. Are you finding more wind-based bedding then? Or are you seeing a lot more cover-based bedding in those types of situations?
It seems like it depends on how thick the area is. If it's a lot, like if there's a lot of deadfall and clear cut and just generally very thick understory, seems like they bet a lot of times, based on either like noise a lot of times, especially for does. And it seems like in those types of areas, less commonly will I see a buck that's bedded just like against a log. It almost seems like there's times when you'll find that same deer like tucked into like 3 trees worth of deadfall. And then he doesn't have to go very far. Like he could still probably stand up and see like out over like an open area. But I don't see him as commonly just like out in the middle of the hardwoods, or out on the middle of like a point with the wind coming over his back. Now, like steep bluff country, totally different story, right? Like you get more open bluff country, and that buck's almost always going to have, it seems like, that worn into the dirt bed where the wind's coming over his back. In marsh areas, it seems like a lot of times they'll bed in the same areas regardless of the wind direction. They might move around a little bit and have different beds, but it seems like they might use the same bed on 2 different winds, or like they're not always tucked into the same spot, but you see less consistency with specific wind directions, it seems like, in certain times when they have that cover around them.
Yeah. Would you think, from based off of what you've seen, would you think that you've seen more bedding based off of wind or cover, or are you thinking like it's just based off of the terrain and the specific area? Or do you think deer have a certain sense that they like more? Do they like to be able to see more, or would they take cover or wind advantage? I'm just generally curious about that.
Yeah, it's a good question. I would imagine, and I can't ask the deer, I don't know the answer, but I would imagine that there's probably some level of individual preference. You get 2 deer on the same property, same age. Maybe one of them prefers to bed in a wind-based spot. One of them prefers to bed where, he can see more, and that's his primary defense. It seems like in practice, when I'm out in the woods, I find more cover-based bedding in thicker areas and more wind-based or sight-based bedding in more open areas. But there's probably exceptions to the rule everywhere you go, I would imagine. Yeah,
and I was going to say I've come to, I guess, similar conclusions on that with the thick cover versus some of the more open hardwood type areas. But it's still, at the same time, I feel like every time I think I have somewhat of an idea with an area, there's just certain ones that throw me off, and it's difficult to understand, what they're kind of looking at there, or I'll bump a deer and I'm like, all right, I'm trying to figure out the situation on how this made sense. It's like, okay, this deer was bedding with the wind, with the wind in his face instead of at his back, and it's just interesting
Yeah.
how the deer do that. So when you're like, so if you're looking at a map and you're e-scouting and you got the aerial imagery pulled up, and say you're looking at an area that has more thick cover, and we're not talking about big, steep ridges and point systems, how are you looking for buck bedding? Are you looking for potential areas to mark to go in and check out, or are you just looking for specific vegetation features? Then you'll figure that out once you get in there.
A lot of times I'll mark all the edge and walk all the edges I can. And the more time that takes me, the more edge there is, and that's generally a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
But I've been wrong a lot of times where I'm like, I bet there's a buck bedded right here. Sometimes there is, sometimes there isn't.
Mm-hmm.
And then sometimes I walk along transition lines and maybe you pick up on something, or there's a trail heading into a thicket and you're like, okay, well, I'll go check this out. And then there's like a nice little wide opening, 15 yards into a clear cut. And it's like, okay, well, the sign's here that the buck's bedded here. I wouldn't have guessed that by looking at the map, but it is what it is. So a lot of times what I like to do in those types of areas is look at leaf off imagery where it becomes really clear as to where all of those transitions are. I mean, even with like the difference between like spruce and tamarack, if you get a leaf off imagery, you can tell the difference between those two tree types. And you look at like hardwoods and you can start to tell the difference between, okay, this is, clearly mature hardwoods, or this is aspen regrowth from an area that was clear cut. And it just makes those little subtle inside or interior transitions, whatever people call them, makes them a lot more obvious than when you're looking at summertime imagery and everything looks green and you don't really know where to walk. So I'll take that leaf off imagery and I'll just go through and I'll draw lines on every transition. And then I'll just make a plan for what's the most efficient way to cover as many of these in one day as I can. And then just tackle that and then do the same thing the next day and the next day until that area, 200 acres, 300 acres, whatever it is thoroughly covered. And then once I'm out actually in the field, that's where I'm marking the beds, I'm marking the rub lines, I'm marking the scrapes and the licking branches. And, here's the random white oak tree. Okay, that's important to know for September. And then a lot of times I might learn that the deer are using it a little bit differently than what I may have assumed once I get out there. Well, then I take those notes and I go back to the aerial imagery. And it's like, okay, based on this new information, how am I going to relook at this now? This area was really good. What else looks like this exact thing? And I'll find 3 or 4 more spots where that's present on the imagery and then go check those out as well.
Yeah, no, that I like. I like how you said you're drawing lines basically around those spots and then trying to find the most efficient way to cover them. So when you're walking those edges, are you sticking to your plan? Are you sticking to your guns with that? Are you kind of modifying that as you're in the woods and as you're walking around and okay, be like, oh, well, if I start, I'm finding a good sign here, but if I start walking this direction or changing plans, it might derail it and I might not cover as much. What for you, are you sticking to your plan 100%? You adapting kind of when you go in, or how are you making that worth your time?
If it's really promising looking sign, I don't hesitate at all to sort of break plan.
Mm-hmm.
And just generally speaking, let's say I have a 4-mile loop mapped out to hit a certain area, a certain loop. Just generally from the little zips and, zags and whatever to check out little things, I end up putting on like 6 or 7 because you're not just always walking in that straight line. You're going and checking in this little spot, check that little spot out, take pictures of this. And so you get back at the end of the day and your map's like, a little squiggly compared to just the nice straight lines that you drew going into it.
Yeah.
And if I only end up hitting 20% of what I wanted to, it's probably because that 20% looked really good and I spent a lot of time in it. And then I can go check the next stuff the next day.
And when you're in there and you're marking all of those things, say, you're marking down the beds and the rubs and the scrapes and all that good stuff you're looking for, when you come back, are you reviewing that information and like kind of looking at it on the map again? What do you do with that information that you find there?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I definitely always look back at it, and it's kind of like a small picture versus big picture thing. They're both important. When you're on the ground, you can look at the small picture stuff, little micro details, and then you look at it back on the map again, and then things start to click. Okay, I saw this sign here and here, and you look at it from kind of the top down. I bet this deer's core area, maybe it spreads this way. I thought it was over here, but the sign's telling me something else. And then you can kind of connect the dots, and before you know it, you're able to draw a little swath of like really good stuff, or you might be able to interpret like where else he might show up. Like assuming we're talking about just, one particular deer that you got a picture of or saw a sign of or whatever.
Yeah.
But then just like generally deer hunting, I can tell like late season right now, like there's an area where I can go in and like cross all these trails and, walk a mile and hit 3 super heavy trails. Right. And then you follow one of those trails and you walk up and down another couple 100 yards and you get another few crossing points. Well, then you take that information, you pull it back up at the 10,000 foot view, and you can kind of connect the dots and be like, okay, they're feeding here. Like I don't have to, like I probably didn't have to confirm that. I could almost just assume that this is where they're going to be feeding right now. It makes sense because of X, Y, Z. And that means they're probably bedded over here. Maybe I take another scouting loop to confirm that. And then I'm able to like get a really clear picture for what's going on with only having spent a little bit of time there.
Yeah. And when you are scouting in the field, how much are you taking into play when you find buck bedding versus doe bedding? Do you have, and like, is there a preference for you there? Are you taking note to both? Are you only paying attention to one? How do you look at the different bedding like that?
I'll usually mark them both. And I guess the importance of it will vary. A lot of times it seems like in these big wood areas that are thicker, it's very hard for me to find buck beds. Like true, where I can just like, yep, this is it. Compare that to say hill country, it's much more obvious.
Mm-hmm.
You can go to hill country, you almost call your shots, there's gonna be a bed here, 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 and here. But I can't do that in the big woods. And sometimes I find those beds and it's like, okay, this makes sense now that I'm in here, but I wouldn't have known to look here otherwise. So I'm definitely marking that because I'm looking at that in the context of what is that deer doing, throughout the year. Early season, maybe it's different than, maybe he's feeding on this white oak flat early season, and then that shifts closer to doe bedding as it gets closer to the rut. So I'm looking at those doe bedding spots also. And it seems like for the most part, the places where the does are very active in the summer and spring, you get a lot of those bucks. It seems like they show up there, right? Makes sense. And that's not like new information either. It's pretty like common knowledge, but you can use the doe bedding information. A lot of times it's easier to find the doe bedding information to where if you're like, I don't have the time to put in to figure out a specific buck and where he's bedding and be able to set up 60 yards from his bed. But I know where these doe groups are, and I've been able to locate 4 different doe groups. You look at those doe groups on the map, 20,000 foot level. How do you connect the dots here? Is there any pinch points? Is there any beaver pond edges? Is there any ditches crossings? And then that's like a pretty good way to kind of set yourself up well for hunting the rut.
Yeah, no, I was just gonna say, with hunting the rut and finding those doe bedding and I knew, and I asked you that question, kind of setting you up for that because I knew that's your approach to it was, reviewing that information after you mark it down, you find those things and looking at it on the map again, pulling it up and being like, okay, yeah, connecting these dots and finding where these things all meet up and almost create like a hub or place they have to go through and with those pinches, especially towards the rut, which I know that's a lot of the time people are focusing on that information. Then maybe, if you're hunting more early season, focused more on those buck beds are more important. But when you were talking about, big woods, buck bedding, it is interesting because I have struggled to find singular buck beds in the big woods, and I need to add context to that again. Not talking like steeper hill country, big woods stuff or mountain country. I'm talking, less terrain, more rolling type country, big woods stuff. It just doesn't for me at least, and it sounds like you're doing the same thing, is I'm looking for those areas of cover, or maybe there is a cut here, or there's some places I'll look for big patches of some sort of hemlock or spruce or something that's creating some different cover here, these edges, and walking those to try to figure out. But in reality, you know, they could be bedded in different portions of that, but it's more of a bedding area versus a bed. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah, it seems like in those areas, I almost have sort of shifted from thinking about, okay, I need to find a specific bed, to I need to understand what this core area is.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe it's, you know, a couple of acres. I suppose the size probably depends on the deer too.
Yeah.
It seems like they don't move a heck of a lot outside of their core area in daylight during early season. During the rut, it seems like they obviously move it quite a bit. But I think there's a lot of times when I'm looking for, let's say, a buck bed, and I probably walk right past it in the big woods because it's just not as obvious and it's not as well worn into the ground, because he's probably not bedding there all the time as much as a deer in bluff country would bed in the same spot for a very common wind direction.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like if you find it or you bump him out of his bed, like that's like the holy grail, right? You're walking through, you're scouting, doing whatever, and you kick this giant out of its bed. Okay, I'm going to learn like as much as I can about this spot and then expand this radius, because now like I just at least look at the wind direction too in case it's wind based. Okay, now I'm starting to put the pieces together on that core area.
Yeah,
it seems like a lot of times I rely on the in-season scouting for that too, where if I don't have anything locked down, like I'll just scout. Like I won't even bring my bow early season if I don't have anything that's like I feel like is a really solid setup. And if I jump a deer, it's like, okay, great, I just learned where that deer was bedding in this area. And then again, back to the e-scouting, you look at the map again, okay, how does this fit into the big picture?
Yeah, exactly. And if you bump them, like same with me, it's like that's perfect, because you understand, okay, he's been in this area, he feels good here. You know, how big is this section that looks similar to this? You know, that he could be bedding on different corners, if, like you said, if it's wind-based bedding, or sometimes, you know, maybe there's a little, if it's like a logging cut and there's a log landing on the interior, you might be bedding on the edge of that at some point, or on the edge of the logging road, or whatever it might be, and just being able to identify those core areas versus the bedding point, you know, that you would typically find in more of the steeper country that has some of that varying terrain. And it's taken me a while to learn that too. Is just, you know, because I just always, you know, growing up and reading things about buck bedding, I was always under the belief that you could never find a singular buck's bed until, you know, I was focused more on steeper terrain. I'm like, okay, I can see where this can make sense. And then, you know, in the bigger woods areas, I mean, that was something mostly that I had learned from my dad, and then eventually got to see, you know, for myself, is that, you know, they have these specific areas that they like, and there might be multiples that they have that are, you know, multiple areas, core areas, you know, within a bigger spot that they'll bounce around to depending on the time of the year, vegetation, food, all of those different things. But trying to identify those, and a lot of times either in season scouting or running cameras around those spots to try to figure out how they're using them, entering, exiting, stuff like that. Is that, how do you, if you're looking at an area that you think a buck is bedding, how are you looking at it and trying to figure out how they're using it and how you're actually going to make a play on it?
I'll put cameras up on scrapes. And if it's not opened up yet, I'll find the licking branch. I've gotten better over the years of finding licking branches, like even in the summer. It's like, okay, this is the right spot. There should be a scrape around here somewhere. Okay, here's the branch. Mm-hmm. And then I can put a camera there. Sometimes it's off. Like maybe I hit the secondary branch and there's like a primary one that I missed. Sometimes it's spot on, and I can adjust those cameras if it's off. But I've learned so much intel just like year over year, where maybe you can gain information from it one year and capitalize on it. If not, then it's information that you got for next year.
Yeah.
But that's taught me quite a bit about, number one, like what deer are using the area from an inventory standpoint, because a lot of those good scrapes, you know, 4 or 5 good bucks will hit them throughout the course of a year. Occasionally I'll put them on pinch points too. And it seems like in the summertime, a lot of those good rut areas, again, like I'm seeing a lot of does and fawns. And so just like that strategy of gaining all of that intel from the cameras is, kind of, again, in supplementing to the e-scouting and supplementing to the boots on the ground, kind of helps put that picture together. And if there's an area where I expect a deer, like a particular buck is bedding, and let's say I get a 10 p.m. picture of this deer, and then like 3 days later I get a 4 p.m. picture, and then I get a 9 a.m. picture, and then I get a 4 a.m. picture. Like, it's just kind of all over the map, but there's several times through like a given time frame that he's showing up during daylight too. It's like, okay, I'm probably very close to, if not within, this buck's core area, because he's moving here during daylight, like on multiple occasions. It might not always be the same time, but he's probably not bedding in the same spot all the time.
Yeah.
So it's like, I know that I'm close, and then maybe I can use that information. Okay, how can I start hunting this smartly?
Yeah. And so when you're talking about, finding those scrapes, are you able to find areas or see trends? Like, if you looked at a map now, can you look at an area and think that this could be an area where I'm going to find a nice scrape at?
Yeah. A lot of times if it's, along those transition lines, and, you got the clear cut that you can see clearly on the map, and then you got maybe like a swamp, and then you got some hardwood ridge. And it's like, okay, along this edge, I know I can walk this edge. And like, let's say, especially on, say, the downwind side of that clear cut, I know there's probably going to be a scrape line there where bucks are just cruising the downwind edge of that, and maybe there's does bedding in the middle.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's just a matter of figuring out, okay, which is the best one of these scrapes. And it seems like a lot of the times the best ones aren't necessarily the ones that are like, on the middle of that scrape line, or necessarily the ones that you can look at you can kind of look at a map almost after the fact. You see the best looking scrape, or you look at your trail camera data year after year, and you're like, man, this scrape's always on fire. You look at the map afterwards and you're like, okay, this makes sense, because maybe there's doe bedding A, B, C, and you kind of have an idea of where some of those bucks are bedding. It's like, this is the most efficient way for him to check multiple areas quickly.
Mm-hmm.
And so kind of knowing that, you can almost kind of, I guess, project a little bit and look at the map and say, like, I know there's going to be scrapes in this area. Maybe there's 40 scrapes I can find over the course of a weekend scouting. But which ones are the best ones? Which ones are the ones that are going to get hit during daylight? And it seems like a lot of times it's, the ones that are close to that heavy cover, or the ones that are in the mix where there's maybe some downward thermal, even if it's like a gently sloping land.
Mm-hmm. And
there's just advantage from a buck to try and use that area.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And it's so much easier, like you said, after you identify a bunch of these things in the woods, to go back and then see what it looks like on the map, and then be able to apply that later. It's hard to just, if you're, new to it, or even to be able to explain it, to be like, okay, this is where, you're going to find a scrape. But once you see those things and you find those different edges and think, it starts to click and just keep rolling through and be able to apply it to different areas.
It's almost like, if you think about different terrain types, you can look at, let's say, like river bottom, cattail marshes, bluff country. Like, all three of those habitat types have very distinct features that are easy to locate on a map. And if it's not being pressured much, you can almost call your shots and be like, I think there's going to be deer bedding there. They almost always are, unless there's pressure there, right? And you can go into a spot with very little experience and figure it out pretty quickly for the most part. But it seems like the big woods, it's like the opposite. It's like, okay, if I want to invest time into this, I might think of it as like a 3-year plan or a 5-year plan. The first year, if I shoot something, that's icing on the cake. But my expectation is it's going to take me several years to really start to figure this out and find things on the ground that make sense, and then relate those back to the map, and then find new spots that look like them, and build this library of information over the years, to where if I've been hunting this place for 15 years, now I got it figured out for the most part,
Yeah. And I think what you said there too is, e-scouting, and really just scouting and hunting in general, in these types of areas, you have to look at it from a multi-year strategy. Like, you have to look at it as, I'm going to, use the best of my knowledge to figure out these spots to check out, and maybe throw some cameras at it, throw some hunts at it, try this out, do some scouting, and then learn what you did, journal that down, and redo it, and redo the process and adapt. Okay, maybe this area had way too much hunting pressure, and moving on, and just continually adapting, like what you had said there.
Yeah. I always like to try and scout stuff that I haven't hunted the year before and try to find like plan B and C areas. Luckily, the last couple of years I haven't needed it, although it seems like the hunting pressure is definitely not letting off in some of the areas I've been hunting. But it's like, at some point, maybe the hunting pressure is just so severe where it's like it's not worth it anymore, and I want to go to a plan B spot. So I'm always like trying to put out feelers, even if it like maybe soaking some cameras and just see what was out in this area, throughout the course of the year. Maybe I learned something that is going to totally pull me away from the place I have been hunting. But yeah, it's definitely not a short pathway to success.
Isn't that the hardest thing though? Like, I know I always want to check out new areas because I just love walking new areas, and it's hard to like find that balance of I need to continually keep refining these areas that I do know and also have these backup plans. But it's so hard. At least for me, I'd love to hear your opinion, but I just want to go and check out new places constantly.
Yeah, it's a constant battle. I mean, on the one side, I absolutely believe you can be more effective if you focus on one particular piece of land. Let's say you got one tag, you're focusing on that one tag, that one area that you've been hunting the last 10 years. I think like by and large, you're going to be more set up for success. But the flip side of that, it's fun to hunt other places, and you learn more things hunting other places, whether the habitat's a little different, the deer use it a little bit different. And I feel like it maybe makes you a more well-rounded hunter for having those little bits of experience that you wouldn't have got if you just stuck with the same place. I feel like in my early years, I bounced around too much, and I saw a lot of things, but it was never like any given year I really felt confident that I was going to have a crack at a giant buck.
Mm-hmm.
But now I'm kind of at the point where I'm more experienced, obviously nowhere near like expert level. Like you're never done learning.
Yeah, you've never ever arrived.
Right, exactly. But it's like, I feel like I'm at the point now where I'm starting to settle down a little bit to where it's like, okay, if I really want my goal to be targeting an older buck, if that's like what it is for any given year, then I can't buy 6 different tags and hunt all these different states. And I can't pick a new piece of public land to hunt every single year. I got to focus in on what I know a little bit more, cut down on the number of tags, and really put it in the time that goal requires.
Yeah. Yeah. It's, when was it? Last year. Oh yeah. Last year I was, that's why I told myself I had one tag. I'm hunting one tag, and that's Pennsylvania. And if I get that tag filled, then I'll think about doing something else. Cause I was just like trying to bounce around like that just doesn't work out in your favor, especially when you're working and you're trying to use time off of vacation or weekends or whatever else to try to get it done. It's just, it's difficult to do that. That's for sure.
Yeah. You can spread yourself too thin pretty easy.
Yeah. So I'm going to go back a little bit here, Garrett. And one of the other things on the vegetation type and looking at that, you talked about leaf off imagery. Is there any specific tree types or things that you think you can identify on a map? Because I know it's hard with like a lot of hardwood stuff and stuff to really be able to understand. But are there any tips or tricks that you use e-scouting to identify specific tree types?
Yeah. With evergreens and swamps, it's fairly easy to identify, say like tamaracks versus maybe like a spruce bog or something like that. But in terms of hardwoods, it's usually more difficult. And the better the imagery is, certainly the better. If I see like a rolling hill in big woods, and I know that there's like oak habitat there, I can assume there's going to be oak trees somewhere on that ridge. But a lot of times it can be somewhat challenging to identify the specific species. If it's a clear cut here in the Midwest, I know it's probably majority aspen, because that's what grows up first. You get the weeds and the forbs, and then the aspens kind of replace that, and then eventually it matures more. If I remember right, from out in Pennsylvania, beech is kind of a common thing that regrows in those clear cuts. So a slight difference there, but it's like same thing with you. If you see a fresh clear cut, you can assume it's like beech, right? In that clear cut. What I found is with like really good resolution imagery, especially if it's leaf off, but not always. You don't necessarily need it. Like the old Bing bird's eye, and like some of the stuff that's, I guess, very similar that's in the works on the Spartan Forge that we've been looking at. You can see enough resolution to where I can look at an oak island and say like a cattail marsh, or look at a ridge. And if you see sort of the pattern of the cluster of leaves and it looks like the canopy is a certain shape and maybe a certain height compared to everything else, then I get better at identifying oak trees in those types of areas. And it definitely helps. It's not like something you can just like figure it out, or I can explain in words like, here's how I identify an oak tree.
Yeah.
But if you look at a map and then you study the way that those tree canopies look, and then you walk the thing on the ground and you've determined like, okay, here's what the actual trees are here. And a lot of times those big like white oaks or big red oaks or whatever, they might have that more circular tree canopy. You can tell by like the way the shadows are, that's a little bit taller than everything else. And it's almost like you see those little clusters of leaves within that canopy. And then you go and confirm that on the ground. It's like, okay, now I know what this looks like. And then you can extrapolate that out and look at these other ridges or these other oak islands and be able to determine like, yep, there's an oak tree here. There's a couple here. It's easier with the big ones. It's a little bit tougher with the smaller ones. And cattail marshes, especially with that type of imagery, you can look at an island and pretty easily be able to tell that it's either, sometimes I like to think of it as a food island or a feeding island or a bedding island. And a lot of times the feeding islands will have more bigger mature oaks, but not as much understory. And so if you're looking at that in high resolution leaf off imagery, you can tell that you can see a lot more of the ground. And you can see these big tree canopies and big trunks, but on the ground, it's more wide open. And then you go walk those on foot, and it's almost like you can see clear across. And a lot of times those deer, unless they're not being pressured, they won't hit those islands and start feeding until like right next to dark or even after dark. But then you find other islands where it's like, I don't see those big tree canopies. Maybe it doesn't look as tall. The shadows look a little bit different, and I can't see the ground at all. Okay, well, that island's a little bit thicker. Maybe it's got majority of trees that are, basketball size and smaller, and it's more likely to hold bedding, but not necessarily have food, at least not massed food.
Yeah.
Probably has browse and things that the deer will nibble on before they go to those bigger oak islands. But definitely when you spend some time looking at that stuff and can verify on foot and then look back at the maps, assuming the resolution's high enough in the imagery, I think you can definitely start to tell at least some key types of trees. So like I can tell the difference between a basswood and a maple looking at the imagery, but
yeah. Well, yeah, me and you were on a call yesterday with the Spartan Forge team, and we talk about Spartan Forge a lot. Obviously, partner of the podcast here, and Garrett and I work very closely on trying to make it better and work with the entire team on pulling all these things that you can find and want to put in there for e-scouting and apply it. And I was blown away when I was seeing some of the new imagery where Bill was taking the measurement tool and you could measure the height of the tree that was in some of those places. Like, that's incredible.
And if some of the listeners remember from like a decade ago, maybe they remember this, Bing had a bird's eye view where it was just like unbelievable imagery. And a lot of it was taken at a slight angle. So you weren't looking straight down, and you could see the trees and you could see where the branches would come off the trees. And it was just like an insane amount of detail. And you could actually spin around and look at it from each direction. You could look at it from the north, from the west, etc. It's the same type of thing that we're talking about here. So if guys are wondering like what an analogy is, if you remember that older stuff, that's kind of what we're talking about here.
Yeah. And it just helps out so much to be able to identify that. And especially I would imagine, with some of those areas with the islands and finding that stuff would be like, you can specifically find your tree right there.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like that picture I sent you the other day, or sent the group, where it was like, hey, here's the tree. And you could see like how the branches are coming off the tree. You could tell probably exactly how I hung my saddle platform in that one.
Yeah, I know that's incredible that's available, I guess, and being able to do that. And one of the tricks that I had found, but I almost don't even like saying it because it can be wrong at times depending on when the imagery was taken. But if you get some in the fall before, where a lot of the leaves are off, or I guess change color, and you still see some that are green, a lot of the times that'll be oak trees that are left over because they take longer to change.
Yep.
And so you can identify them that way in areas that are, a lot of areas of Pennsylvania that are a lot of mix, and you might only find a few oak trees in certain areas. You can identify them a little bit easier, but it's that can be subjective, I guess, is why I'm putting a little bit of an asterisk next to it.
Yeah. Yeah. It seems like the leaves on those oaks too, in a lot of areas, they'll hang on to those dead leaves up in the canopy a little bit longer. So it's like if you hit that imagery just right in the time of the year where like most of the leaves are off, but you got those trees that still have a little bit of, that kind of orangish brownish leaf on it. It's like, okay, that's probably an oak.
Yeah, no, that's true. It's tough. It makes it difficult to figure out exactly that when you're looking at it, but it's just another little tool just to keep in the back of your mind that might be able to help you out and go in the details there. One of the other things, I know that you use some other tools and some different types of mapping and things to when you're doing your scouting, and I'd like to hear you talk about those tools a little bit and how you're using them exactly.
So sometimes what I will use, especially like in bluff country, I like to use either Lidar maps or like slope angle shading, especially if it's an area where I know there's going to be vertical aspects of the terrain. We have areas in like southern Minnesota, for example, where you get, let's say, fairly steep hills, like 20-ish degrees grade, for the most part. Some areas steeper, getting closer to like 40 degrees. But then you'll have like a ring around a bluff, or a ring around like a point that's just like 10 foot of vertical rock. And on just standard topo maps, it's tough to tell that that's going to be there. And you might look at the hybrid view and pre-plan your route, and then you go and walk in there and you're like, I can't climb this. Right. So if you look at either like a slope angle or like a Lidar, which is just much higher resolution topography mapping, where a lot of times it'll be presented as like they call it a lot of times a DEM, or it's just like an elevation map that shows you in shaded relief, like very high detailed shaded relief, what the landscape looks like. And that gives you some different insight because you're not looking at like leaf cover or trees or anything like that, but you're looking very specifically at what does this actually look like on the ground? And you can tell where there are those vertical areas. You can tell where there's gaps in those vertical bluffs where it's like, okay, here's vertical, this whole, 200 yards along this ridge. And then it turns into like yellow on the slope angle shading. And you go, and then it turns back into cliff again. And you go walk up in there and there's that gap. And it's like, there's a beat down in the trail, or beat down to the dirt trail going up through that gap because the deer can't climb up the vertical cliff. And you might find beds up on top of those bluffs. And from like a wind-based bedding perspective, you find a lot of beds like right on the top of those type of features. Similar type of thing down in the bottoms. If you've got creek drainages that are running out of those valleys, if it gets steep enough and eroded enough, you'll get those vertical ditches. And occasionally you might have like, let's say the drainage itself is 100 yards wide, but then there's like this little 10-foot wide ditch that's running throughout that. And maybe in some areas it hugs closer to one ridge and then it kind of like goes across and hugs closer to the other ridge. Maybe it's running right down the middle. And then maybe you can see where there's another ditch that is coming from a different drainage and they kind of meet up and make a Y. And it's like, okay, if I see stuff like that, then I know that it's number one going to be steep enough where deer are not just going to go across anywhere across that valley. Like I'm probably going to be able to go into a drainage like that and find very specific places where those deer are crossing those ditches. And then a lot of times you'll find scrapes nearby. So it's like, okay, now from like an access standpoint, I might be able to walk like near or even maybe in some of these ditches, be able to pop up and sit next to a scrape that's close to like a major crossing over those ditches where deer are dropping down those points. And maybe I can use the thermal, downward thermals to my advantage to kind of suck them through that drainage. And the reason I kind of lay that scenario out is maybe you're looking at the next drainage over and you can tell that there's a drainage there in like a creek bed, but it's not nearly as steep. It's like, okay, the deer could probably cross wherever here. So then between A and B, if I'm e-scouting, I can look at the one that has the more steep terrain and say, this is probably an area where I can find very specific trails that the deer have to use because it's the only way they can navigate that terrain.
Yeah, so you're able to find more of those dedicated pinch points per se, to be able to do that. And so where do you find, those Lidar maps and everything? Where do you find those at to be able to take a look at it?
Yeah, so interestingly, a lot of counties or states will have that data available because they'll use it for other uses like, agricultural data or, city planning type work. So a lot of times it's worth just like Googling Lidar and like whatever your county is just to see if they have anything available. I know back in the day I'd use CalTopo a bit too to get that type of information. And I'd say what I use the most time in like Minnesota is just like the state-based stuff. But I think eventually we get to a point where that's on the app also. And then again, it's just be like a one-stop shop, and that'll make life a lot easier. Because a lot of those sources that I'm using to look at these features, not necessarily things that I can use out in the field. Mm-hmm. I'm looking at them ahead of time to pick areas to go run into, and then I'm using my phone-based stuff when I'm actually out in the field, and then kind of cross-reference.
Yeah, because that would be able to, because in case you did miss something, being able to have that available on your phone, when you get there, or if you're going to another plan B area or something, and being able to plan your routes in, I feel like would be, especially if you're traversing some of that bluff country where there is some more cliffs and bands like that, to be able to find the best way of access. Yeah,
especially if you got an area where you get that steeper terrain, you got a bluff gap that's 200 yards back from the point kind of hooks around to where that like on a northwest wind, there's probably going to be like a deer bedding on that point. You could set your access up in such a way that, maybe you're coming in from the bottom, but from the opposite direction, you're coming up through that bluff gap. You get the wind just into your advantage. You kind of walk the edge of that bluff, and then you can set up within, 100, 150 yards early season on some white oaks. And you can really pre-plan a very specific hunt using that type of information. It's still not an easy one to pull off because a lot of times that time of year there's oaks everywhere and they can just basically feed almost out of their bed during daylight. But
where do you typically see it? So I haven't hunted a lot of country that has like a lot of the bluffs like that you're talking about. Where do you typically see the bedding as far as bucks bedding and those types of situations? You said up against some of those walls. Do they bed up against them, or how are they using that?
Yeah, I see a lot of beds like just generally on points, just like everybody talks about. And then you also see some that are on the top edges of bluffs where they kind of look out over the top of that bluff, and the thermals are pulling right up that rock face and from all the way down beneath them. And you might also see them like on the bottom edges of those bluffs where they're a little bit more hidden, to where like if you were up on top, like you would never know he was down there. And in the bottoms, I'll find bedding too. It's a little bit harder for me to predict oftentimes where you'll see beds in the bottom. Sometimes it relates to cover that's in those drainages. Mm-hmm. A lot of times they'll be full of like blowdown or just different, thicker type cover. Or maybe you got a marshy area along a creek and that is holding some bedding. So it kind of varies, but those are the standard areas that I tend to find them.
Yeah. Okay. And so speaking of bedding and what you were just saying there, I mean, it's the same. If anybody's hunted mule deer, it's kind of how they bed up against a lot of those, with the bluffs you're talking about, when sometimes they bed right below them. They do that a lot in the West and the Rocky Mountain states, with mule deer bedding up against with those rocks to their back, the big ones above, so that you can almost be right over top of them and you're looking straight down, and you have to be directly above them to be able to see down essentially on top of them.
It'd be pretty cool to figure that out to where you can have a very similar type of hunt where it's, I got the wind, he's going to be better on that bluff, and you go stalk up above him.
Very blind stalk. It's not like you're glassing it. You're like, all right, I'm just going to guess, and we're going to go in there and try to figure it.
It's just big suspense up until you like peek your eyes over and you have no idea if he's going to be there or not.
Yeah, exactly. But what about, you'd mentioned bottoms quite a few times here, and big woods type areas. Again, we're not talking about big, tall ridges and stuff. We're talking about big woods. Do you find bucks bedding in the bottoms? Do you find deer bedding in the bottoms? How much what do bottoms mean to you?
I always look at them and we'll look at the sign there and try and think of it in the context of, number one, like, what can I learn from this? Even if I can't hunt it, just due to like swirling winds or whatever, I could probably learn stuff about that bottom area that helps me get a better perspective of, is this a high deer density drainage? Is it a low deer density drainage? Is this place tore up a giant sign? Are there big tracks down here? Like, that'll help me determine too, like, if that area is like worth putting time to, just generally, even if I can't hunt down there. But a lot of times also I'm looking for areas like that scenario earlier where it's like, maybe it's a rut hunt and the wind's blowing out of the drainage to where it's minimal swirling, or I just kind of, cross my fingers and hope, but it's worth sitting there because there's a huge creek, like ditch crossing there, or there's a big primary hub scrape down there. And it's like, okay, well, I'll access through that ditch and just, play my cards right and hope to have success. But yeah, I'm definitely looking down there and trying to find avenues that I can take advantage of doing that type of a hunt whenever I can.
Mm-hmm. When it comes to those bottoms, is there any like certain feature in the bottoms that you're looking for, from vegetation type? Maybe it's where multiple drainages run together, or beaver ponds, or what are those things that kind of jump out at you when it comes to looking at bottoms from a map?
Yeah, I look at what's around that bottom. If it's a bottom that has 2 points dropping into it versus one that's got 5 points dropping down into it, then I'll feel more enticed to go check out the one that's got 5, because there's just more potential habitat and more potential bedding opportunities, more potential deer using that area. And I'll try to look for areas that indicate this isn't like a spot where multiple things are coming together, right? Those classic hub type areas where you might find that hub scrape, or maybe I can see the trails dropping off these points and, 3 of them go within 20 yards of this tree. Just trying to play the game like that. And maybe it's an area where the bottom is just not huntable. Maybe it's just too steep, or it's too thick, or it just doesn't make a lot of sense. And I just know, like, okay, I'm going to have to hunt the tops in this area.
Yeah.
But I'm generally looking for terrain-based stuff as much as anything, and kind of how the deer are using that and what's contextually around that particular bottom as much as what's in it specifically.
Yeah, no, it's the diversity of what's around you from the terrain and the vegetation and everything there. So what else can you kind of think of from an e-scouting standpoint that I haven't asked you from that? Because there's so many different ways that we can dive into this, but is there something that I didn't ask you good as far as a question or a style that you have or something that you want to share with it?
I think we covered a lot of good stuff. One thing that I do quite commonly too when I'm scouting is I'll use different colors for certain things. If I find something that's from boots on the ground scouting, I find a scraper or bed or whatever, I'll mark it a certain color. If it's something where I anticipate there being bedding, maybe I'll use a different color. So I know it's like not a confirmed thing, but I just anticipate it's there, and then I know I want to go check it out on foot. If it's hunter sign, I'll use a separate color for that. And whether it's a line or whether it's a waypoint, that's just kind of a way for me to kind of collect my thoughts so I can look at a map in its entirety and not just be thrown off by all of these monotonous looking waypoints. I can even like a level of specificity too on like the type of scrape. If it's a community scrape versus just like a standard scrape along a scrape line, I'll use a different icon for that. Or if it's like the place where I have a trail camera sitting over a scrape, I'll use that scrape trail camera icon instead of having two icons stacked on top of one another to where I forget that there's a trail camera there because the scrape icon's over it.
Yep.
Just like ways to try and make my viewing experience to where it's not just a cluttered mess.
Yeah. I agree with that because like, so just to give you my, my thought on this, 'cause I love color coding and I love using the different icons. Like anywhere that I have a trail camera, I'll use the trail camera icon or the cell cam icon, whatever it is, but then I make them blue. But I also will mark, if I find a scrape that I want to run a camera on, I'll run that blue, so then if I'm looking at it from, say, I'm going to be going in the area to start dropping cameras off or whatever, I can kind of see where my cameras are going to be located at and how they look from the bigger scale. Say I found a community scrape, that I would mark that color because I want to run a camera on it or whatever. And I mark my stand or my stand location or my tree locations. I mark them, tan or whatever different color, so I can go and look at all the potential setups that I have and see those quickly instead of everything being, say red or brown and everything just looks the same across the board. And even if they are icons, even if you do change the icons, it's tough to be able to determine it from that 10,000 foot view that you're looking at, to be able to do that. So that's a very good add-on that you had there.
Yeah, that reminded me of something too. Some of the better areas that I found in big woods, in flatter big woods, it's almost like when I look at all of my trail camera placement and you look at it from the high level view, it's almost like a grid. Whereas it's not just like, oh, I got this big swath of cameras along this line. It's like every time I was out scouting and I wanted to put a camera here, or whatever, and then you look at it, it's like, man, this is like a grid because there's so much diversity to be able to support. I need a camera here. I need a camera here. Yeah. That just gives you like a ton of options.
Yeah, as I'm talking to you, I have my app pulled up and I'm looking at one of the areas that I have a bunch of cameras in, and the way that it's how they're spread out. And it's like you said, it's like a grid, and this is one of the areas that's like that, and it's hilarious. And and I notice that like if I have areas that is more steeper, then they're more. Sometimes I have them more in a line, not like a perfect line, but down the different elevation zones and the bench systems and moving it that way, and just trying to cover some of those different spots. And I just think using tools like this and keeping yourself organized and being able to utilize that information is so big, because if you can go through and mark everything you want, but if you don't have a way of categorizing it and being able to use that information going forward in a useful way, it doesn't really do that much for you.
Right.
Yeah,
exactly.
So I did want to, I had some questions, from Instagram. So just like an hour and a half before we started doing the podcast, I'd ask people some questions, and I tried to implement a bunch of them into this without having to specifically ask them, but there's a few of them here that I think would be important to cover here on the end, because I don't think we covered them specifically. But, one person was talking about woody swamps in the big woods. And so how are you looking at those from an East Scouting standpoint? If you see kind of a swampy area within the big wood setting, I would imagine, I haven't been there, but maybe northern Minnesota and Wisconsin and some areas like that would have more of those types of locations.
He called it woody swamps?
Yeah.
Specifically?
Woody swamps. Is that what he's talking about?
Yeah, I'm thinking, when I hear that terminology, I think of like tamarack swamps, spruce swamps, things where you got water and you got marsh, but it's timbered. It's not just like cattails. It's not just like wiregrass marsh. And so it's kind of a similar type of story there, where everything, for me at least, revolves around edge. You'll find areas where deer will cut through those types of swamps. A lot of times the bedding itself will be on the edges, especially if you got like a tamarack tree's got a big root ball, a big root system that's like generally dry, especially if you got a big one. And a lot of times those will hold beds. But you might have, let's say you have a 300 acre tamarack swamp. You won't find beds just kind of like sporadically mixed throughout that entire swamp. Generally, it's going to be on the edges. And I think that's partly because if they get pressured, they can go way back into the, vastness of that swamp. But it's also closer to the other stuff that they're going to want to try and get out and feed in or move to or whatever. A lot of times it'll be very popular for people to hunt those types of things in like Wisconsin or Minnesota, where you'll have a guy who just climbs up like 40 feet or 30 feet up a tamarack tree, like right on the edge. And he's out there with a rifle and he can just see like 300 yards on the edge. Fairly common. But also from like a bow hunting standpoint, some of the better woody type swamp areas that I find is where they're close to other types of edge. And it's not just like one big spruce swamp and that's it. And it's next to like just monotonous timber. Like an example of an area where it might be more worth my time. I know one spot where I got a tamarack swamp and it's got like, we'll say like a 50-yard strip of marsh. And the other side of that is like clear cut. And you got that mixture there where there's multiple different types and you get a lot of deer activity going kind of back and forth between the two, kind of going parallel along those lines, a lot of scrapes in there. Whereas sometimes you don't find that same level of diversity if you're, hunting just like a big area where it's all just one swamp type. So definitely looking at those in the context of other things around them and not just focusing on here's the swamp. How do I hunt it?
Yeah, that's and like I think most of the swamps that I've hunted have been like, I don't even know if some people consider them swamps. I do, because I mean it might not be necessarily like not like a lot of water. Essentially, it might be softer, mushy kind of grasses and dewberry and stuff that's all kind of tied in with it, and a little bit of water depending on the year that's there, but it's open around it. And then you'll have a little bit higher ground pieces, and you'll have some hemlocks and pines, and then maybe a clear cut on this side. And like you said, when you find all that diversity in those types of areas, those edges can be so good. And I know for me, I find a lot of sheds in those areas too. And where there'll be, that's where I find a lot of the bedding with that is like, you'll see a little bit of the higher ground on those, or just on the edges of those spots, or maybe a group of trees that kind of goes out into the swamp a little bit, and some trees that are blown down a little bit, give a little bit of cover there, and they're overlooking the swamp, but I'll find sheds in the beds and stuff there as well.
Yeah. I have one. This shed was,
holy cow, nobody can see this but geez.
So that shed was found underneath a tamarack tree where you had 3 different habitat types kind of within a swamp, all very close to meeting. Mm-hmm. And so that deer was bedding in that area, but he was also using it as kind of a corridor. And it was interesting how he used it, because he would use it in such a way where he was very rarely next to a tree that was huntable. He would just kind of move throughout the swamp, and the tamarack that he was bedding under was quite small. And there was kind of small ones nearby, but there was also a lot of like tall, grassy, and like almost like, I don't know if it's actually switchgrass. It looks like switchgrass. And you got kind of this little like red osier dogwood mixed in there. Mm-hmm. Just like this mix of a whole bunch of stuff. And yeah, late season, he was definitely in there. And to your point, if you got that and you got all those things kind of acting as thermal cover too in those woody swamps, they definitely spend a lot. And you have the woody browse there. So like late season and finding sheds, absolutely.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I think that basically about covers it for this one, Garrett. I appreciate you taking the time and coming on here and talking with me. I enjoyed it, and it's got me excited to want to look at some more maps and start planning here as it's kind of getting into the dead of winter, and looking at, my spring scouting spots and getting back into it. So I'm excited about that.
Oh yeah, me too.
Are you going to come back to Pennsylvania? That's the question I have.
Probably at some point. It's just a matter of when.
Yeah, maybe you'll have to come back and maybe if you ever get some time to do some spring scouting and, whatever, and do some more hunting out here.
Yeah, it's really cool habitat. So I would like to come out there again.
Yeah, you got to spend some time right with Johnny Stewart too, didn't you? With doing some scouting and hunting there. And Johnny knows his stuff around here, that's for sure.
Oh yeah. Yeah, it was really fun learning from him and just kind of like shutting up and just letting him talk.
Yeah.
Just soaking it all in.
That's what I do. Every time I'm with him, I just let him talk and I just soak it in like a sponge.
Yep.
Well, anyways, Garrett, where can people find some more where you're putting out your stuff and then follow along a little bit?
So most of my content's on my YouTube channel, which is called DIY Sportsman. And I also have a lot of content that I'll put out on Instagram at DIY_sportsman. Most of the stuff that I have on Facebook is just cross-posted from Instagram. So I don't really follow or post on Facebook quite as much individually. So those would be kind of the two places that you'd find a majority of the stuff I'm putting out. There's also a podcast that I run through the Sportsman's Nation podcast network that you can either find by searching that or the DIY Sportsman podcast. And I post every other week for that one.
Okay, awesome. Well, thank you for coming on, Garrett. I really do appreciate it. I'm excited to keep working with you and keep making, hopefully making the Spartan Forge app just continually getting better from that standpoint and making it easier for all of us on the e-scouting standpoint.
Oh, yeah. Definitely a fun journey.
Yep, that's for sure. All right, we'll talk to you soon, Garrett.
Yep, talk to you later.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of East Meets West Hunt with your host, Beau Martonik. For more great content and to stay up to date, visit eastmeetswesthunt.com, Facebook at East Meets West Outdoors, and Instagram at East Meets West Hunt. If you enjoyed today's episode, please review and subscribe, and we'll catch you next time.